Hello and welcome to the guide to the Meno paper for ancient and medieval philosophy. First, a quick run through of turning stuff in. So the paper can be done with a draft. This is submitted on Canvas via an assignment, and you can do as many drafts as you wish, and you can wish to do 0. Drafts are scored and commented on, but not graded. By this I mean I'll put a number on it so you'll know what you would get if you turned it in as your final version, but the draft doesn't count towards or against your final grade. The draft available until date is the final opportunity to submit the draft, and this is because I would need enough time to read your draft, and you need at least some time to revise it. In terms of turning in the final version of the paper, there are 3 options, and this may seem needlessly complicated, but there are good reasons for this. First is the on-time, also known as the +5 bonus deadline, and this involves submitting the paper through Canvas, as all this is done, and be sure that it's a readable Word or PDF file, and that is to say that Canvas can read it, so I can comment on it. If I can't read it, I can't grade it, and be sure to turn in the right paper, not one from another class or something. I don't accept printed or email copies because you can just turn in through Canvas. And the +5 bonus is if you turn the paper in by this date, which is the true due date for the paper, you get +5. There's no extensions to this because it's extra credit. The reason for this, obviously, is extra credit. People ask me in my class, is there extra credit? And I say yes. And for the paper, it's the +5 bonus. Now, what if you need more time? Or just, something happens? In that case, there's the emergency deadline. Even though it's called emergency deadline, it doesn't require an actual emergency because you can use it without any documentation or permission. You don't have to ask me or email me or do any paperwork. You just go and turn the paper in, and as long as it's turned in through the emergency deadline and it's on time, you would get full credit. Now you may wonder what happens if something serious happens. You can't, work on the paper. Examples would be being called up for National Guard duty. Another example, a real one that occurred, is a wall fell on one of my students in the past, and he came to class and both arms were in casts. And so, yes, he definitely got an extension for that. So things that would severely impede your ability, to complete the paper on time, let me know, and I'd be happy to work with you. And of course, this goes through Canvas for the emergency deadline, same as the on-time deadline, in terms of mechanics. So make sure that it's a readable file, Word or PDF is safe, and make sure it's the correct paper for the class. Now, the final deadline option is the 50% deadline. So the emergency deadline is because stuff happens, so that's the reason for that. The 50% deadline is because sometimes lots of stuff happens, but there's no excuse in the sense that it's nothing that would grant an extension to the class. Like someone, classic example is I've had people say, is something like them an email, I'm not going to lie, I totally forgot about the paper, is there anything I can do? That type of scenario. In that case, there's the 50% deadline, and it's way, way at the end of the semester. Typically, I make it the last day of finals, 11:59 p.m., but of course, check in case that happened to have changed. Generally, it won't, but always good to check. And in this case, you get partial credit, and anything submitted after that, which in a way can't be done because the close the assignment, would be a 0. Goes through Canvas, it must be readable Word or PDF, and must be the right paper, the usual stuff. And the paper needs to be turned in just once. So again, these 3 options are to, one for extra credit if you want that, turn it for the +5 deadline. If you need more time or something happens, but you can still have the paper done by the emergency deadline, use that. And if something happens like forgetting about the paper being in the class, then the 50% deadline. But you only have to turn the paper in for one of these. So you'll see on Canvas, there'll be an assignment for each of these and a grade for each of these. And there'll also be a overall category of paper. And so one thing that often disconcerts people is that they'll say not do the +5 deadline paper or +5 bonus paper, and then I get a panicked email, why do I have a 0 in this? I didn't do a paper for it. And I'll reply back reasonably that, you didn't do the paper, and so the score for that would be a 0. And then I'll, of course, also explain that If they turn it in for the emergency deadline, that will be their score. Or of course, if they turn it for the traditional deadline, that will be their score as well. So there are 3 assignments for the paper. You only have to do one, and the best one of those 3 counts. So if you just do one, which is what you're supposed to do, you'll see 2 zeros there, but that's working as intended because it's just the overall paper grade. And that's the stuff about the draft and turning the paper in. Now, in terms of the actual content of the paper, the Meno paper is, surprisingly enough, about Plato's Meno, about the doctrine of recollection. And the reading for this is the Meno, and it's in the course PDF. I also included it in the PDF paper guide, so everything you need for the paper is in there. The thesis of the paper is this. I'm printed right there. The purpose of this paper is to summarize and critically evaluate the debate between Socrates and Meno. The overall issue of the paper is, does Socrates logically refute Meno's argument? Does Socrates make his case? So the goal of the paper is to summarize and critically evaluate the debate between Socrates and Meno and address that issue. Does Socrates succeed? Does he refute Meno? Does he prove his point? The paper is a 4-part paper. It's got an introduction, it's got a summary, it's got an argument, and it's got a conclusion. The introduction and conclusion are pretty straightforward. And be sure to label these sections for the very practical purpose that one good reason is that way you do each section, like, okay, my intro, I got to do this. My summary, I got to do that. Argument, I got to do this. Conclusion, do that. Also, when I grade it, the points are by the section. So if you label it, I know which part is which in terms of grading. And sometimes I can kind of sort it out if it's not labeled, but sometimes, to be honest, I'll have no idea, especially like if a paper is generated by AI, it generally kind of like slops everything together. And then that's, a bit of a mess. And so be sure to label each of the 4 parts, again, for your convenience, for knowing what you need to do in each section, and makes it easier for me to grade it. Also, of course, the points rest on it. So if a paper doesn't have these sections at all, it's just a bunch of stuff, then of course that would be bad for the grade. Introduction, super straightforward. Should be about 125 words, half a page or less, because it's only worth 5 points. The current record for the introduction is 6 pages. They get all 5 points, but that was a lot of pages for 5 points. This needs to include the thesis, where you can just copy it, no problem there. A statement of the summary, like in this paper I will summarize Plato's Meno. A position statement where you briefly state your position on the issue. Your argument statement where you very briefly say how you're going to argue. And then some minimal background. Perhaps something like in the Meno, the characters of Socrates and Meno debate about Plato's doctrine of recollection. And there's more details for this with examples in the PDF paper guide. It's also a complete sample paper. The summary is where you get into more of the stuff. So for the summary, it should be 350 words or more. There is you have to hit like a certain word count for Gordon Rule stuff, etc. So keep that in mind. But I don't arbitrarily say, well, you got 349 words, but then you fail. And likewise, it could be thousands of words and still be terrible. It's graded based on the quality, but it takes a certain amount of words, obviously, to complete the assignment. It's worth 45 points out of the 100 for the paper, so pretty big chunk. The objectives are to convey the key points of the Meno dialogue clearly, concisely, accurately, and in your own words. Now, the dialogue goes through like step by step by step by step by step, so you don't have to provide an exacting blow by blow account or transcript of the steps that Socrates walks Meno's servant through. You can do a brief account of the process, hitting some of the highlights, because it would just be tedious to go through a summary where it just simply said Socrates did this, Meno said that, Socrates said that, etc., etc. The idea is, again, to summarize, not do like a transcript. That's what the dialogue is. So in terms of what's in there, here's my condensed version of the Meno. So I broke it into some parts. Like, here's the first part. So the first part, we have Meno's argument as reconstructed by Socrates. So the Meno is about the question of knowledge. And Meno challenges Socrates for the following argument. Pretty straightforward argument. The first premise is this: if a man knows, then he has no need to inquire. Second premise: if a man does not know, then he cannot do this inquiry, for he does not know the very subject about which he is to inquire. And so the conclusion of this dilemma is that therefore a man cannot inquire about that which he does not know. And so this is a kind of like a skeptical challenge, trying to argue that you can't know, because if you know, you can't inquire, and if you can't inquire about what you don't know. And so that's the argument put forth by Meno. Now, what Socrates has to do, of course, is respond to this. And what follows, of course, is a condensed version of Socrates' response. So one argument he begins with is a reincarnation and knowledge argument from authority. And this will figure, of course, into the argument part of it, because it's argued by authority. And the question would be, is it a good one? So what he says is, based on the authority of the priests, priestesses, and poets, the soul has the following qualities. It's immortal, it's born again after death, and is never destroyed. How does this tie into the problem of knowledge? Well, according to Socrates, since the soul has been born again many times, it has seen all the things in this world and the world below, so here in the afterlife. Hence, he infers it has knowledge of them all, and the soul should remember all that she has learned about all things. And there should be no difficulty in eliciting out of a single recollection all the rest. Therefore, he concludes, Meno's argument is flawed. And it's essentially, the core of it is, again, the argument from authority. Essentially, the priests, priestesses, poets, and such say soul is immortal. So then he adds in like how this should work. So that's argument one, an argument from authority. Next, he goes to his proof. It's essentially an explanation argument. So he talks the servant through this geometric proof. And again, he grinds through it like step by step, like every single part. But when summarizing it, the important thing is not, like Socrates said this, then the person responded back this, and then, this and this. The main thing is just to sort of do a quick, concise summary of how Socrates claims to have simply, talked this person through the proof. But his explanation is this: not that he, gave the person the answers, but he concludes that the boy, the servant, has innate knowledge of geometry. How so? Well, he claims that he, Socrates, was helping the slave bring to conscious what he already knows. Thus, he claims, education is a recollection of innate ideas that are already in there. So, how does this work according to Socrates? Well, in the third part, he brings up the notion of true notions. So he claims that it wasn't Socrates, feeding to the slave these ideas, leading him, through it, but the answers given by, a slave were given out of his own head. Yet he didn't know that he had these answers, but he had in him these notions. So Socrates concludes that a person who doesn't know may still have true notions of what they don't know. So it's kind of in there. So he continues his argument with the acquisition of knowledge dilemma. So what he concludes in this, the way he argues is this, in argument 3. If he were frequently asked questions, he would know as well as anyone. And if he is asked questions, he will recover his knowledge without being taught. This knowledge, which he now has, must either have been acquired or always possessed. And that's the dilemma. Option 1 is must been acquired or always possessed. And so if he has always possessed this knowledge, one horn of the dilemma, he would have always known. If he had acquired the knowledge, he could not have acquired it in this life unless he had been taught geometry. But this is critical to Socrates' case, of course, that he claims the slave has not been taught geometry, according to the word of Meno, yet he has knowledge. And so Socrates concludes that if he did not acquire, to finish up the Meno, if he did not acquire the knowledge in this life, he infers he must have learned it at some other time, which must have been at a time when he was not a man. Roughly put, when he was dead. If there have always been true thoughts in him, both the time when he was and when was not a man, and he means in this case, being alive and being dead, which only need to be awakened into knowledge by putting questions to him, his soul must have always possessed this knowledge, for his always either was or is not another dilemma here. Those are the two options, either alive or, not alive. If the truth of all things always existed in the soul, then the soul is immortal. Therefore, Meno's initial claim is false. So Socrates infers from this dilemma, kind of like a double dilemma argument, that Meno is mistaken. So he advances those three arguments to draw the conclusion that you can inquire to what you don't know because of the doctrine of recollection. And this is kind of central to Plato's epistemology. So how does the summary get graded? Well, I have the summary assessment detailed in the paper guide. Essentially, it's with these handy boxes of assessment. So content and completeness, let's say, includes all the key points from the Meno. The clarity, writing is clear and easy to follow. Presentation, it's appropriately polished, etc. Accuracy, it's accurate. Conciseness, that it's not fluffy. Organization, good logical structure and flow. Citations, if any are used, properly cited, etc., avoiding plagiarism. And of course, originality, and last, relevance, because the idea of one comment I often make in the summary is summary as opposed to being, commentary, etc. And sorry, this is a typo. This should be the Meno. I have included also a rubric, which goes through great, in the paper guide, great detail about exactly how the grading is done. I'll also, of course, when I grade the paper, I'll put comments on it, so you'll know why the grade is what it is. But this is, what is aimed for. So excellent would be, kind of repeat of that, clearly and concisely and accurately, etc. It's about clarity, coherence, etc. And then a good one would, do most of it, do it good, but not, great. And then adequate gets the job done. It's not good, it's not bad, it's adequate. A poor summary has some defects, but not fatal flaws. Might have, a few major flaws, lots and lots of minor flaws, but it's not fatally bad. A failing summary, it leaves out most of the key points, unclear, disorganized, major flaws, it's bad. And there's a range here, in kind of oddly, the failing one has the biggest range of points because it could be anywhere from 0, which would be turning in nothing or something totally irrelevant, up to 26, which would be, pretty, still bad, but not nothing. So that's the summary and rubric and stuff. Now, the third part of the paper is the argument. And so we're, almost through, because after this is just the conclusion. So the argument section is about 500 plus words. Again, I base it on the quality, and you have to keep keep track of the words for Gordon rule, blah, blah, blah. And you have to have, enough words to do the objectives of the paper. It's worth 45 points. You should begin it by stating your position on the overall issue. Does Socrates, basically, does he succeed? Does he refute Meno? Does he make his case? So the first one is the argument from authority. The issues, this has sub-issues, and you'd want to, you need to state your position on these as well. So is that argument that he uses, the argument from authority, a good argument? And the second question is, this is kind of the impact. Does the argument refute or help to refute Meno? Because you may agree that the argument is good, but a good argument could actually be irrelevant to what it's trying, to what its objective is in terms of trying to support Socrates. Obviously, if you think the argument is bad, it wouldn't help. But if it's good, it could help, but oddly enough, may not help. So how do you tell if you've got a good argument from authority? So how does one assess that argument from authority? Now, fortunately, assessing arguments from authority are pretty straightforward. An argument from authority is defined in the following way. Shockingly enough, it's an argument in which the conclusion is supported by citing an authority. The gist of it is this is true because an authority claims that it's true. Now, the strength of such an argument, which is inductive, because it's an argument that gives you probability at best, not certainty. So the strength of this argument depends on the quality of the authority. Essentially, the idea makes sense that the more credible the authority, the more likely is that what they claim is true. Now, in this case, by authority, I don't mean someone who's got like political authority and can, gets elected office and can just order people around. It's expertise. It's sometimes called an argument from expertise because authority has definitely drifted away from expertise. It's always been separate, of course. Now, this argument is relatively weak because what you're doing essentially is saying this claim is true because this person who is supposed to be an expert makes the claim, and so you're essentially relying on their expertise. It's not to say that it's a bad argument, but compared to other arguments, it's relatively weak. It's better to have, say, direct proof for a claim than simply saying, hey, the person says it, they're an expert, so it's probably true. But we have to rely on them because in so many cases, we lack the knowledge or expertise ourselves, and we need to rely on outside sources. We do this quite often. For example, if you go to like your doctor and they say, hey, you've got you're worried you have like COVID, for example, but instead you've got a cold, and you believe them, you're following an argument from authority. If you have someone, working on like your car or your air conditioner or your laptop, and they tell you what the problems are, you're trusting them based on their expertise. And similarly, if we rely on people who are, like scientists, professors, etc., we're relying on their expertise. They're also used by experts themselves to add weight to their own position. So a person who's an expert in a field may cite other experts, and we commonly do, to say, okay, I say this, but I'm not alone in saying this, that these other experts agree as well. And arguments from authority are often used as parts of larger arguments. You try to establish like a claim like Socrates does. He establishes what he thinks is a claim and then builds from there. Now, the form of it, pretty straightforward. It's an argument that's got two premises and a conclusion. And every argument's got, one conclusion, one or more premises. So the first premise is that person A is an authority on subject S, whatever it might be. Premise 2 is the person A makes claim C about subject S. Conclusion, therefore C is true. Put less like symbolically, you simply say this authority makes this claim, and therefore this claim is true. Or this claim is, or just simply, you do like a one sentence thing, this claim is true because this authority says so, with the premises and conclusion, implied in there. So how do you tell when an argument from authority is a good one? Now, again, authority in this case doesn't mean political authority. So just because someone's like a president or a senator or a Supreme Court judge or whatever, merely having a position of political or legal authority means nothing in terms of like logical expertise, in terms of being an expert in the subject. Now, a person could be in a position of political authority and have expertise. Like you could have someone who is, say, an actual medical professional who's the head of the CDC, or you could have someone who's, in the Senate, but is actually, a sensible, reasonable medical doctor, in which case their expertise doesn't come from being in the Senate or whatever. It comes from their skill. So how do you tell when someone's an expert? Well, quickly put, and there's more, more details about this in the paper guide. The first and most obvious thing is the person has to have sufficient expertise in that subject. People often, accept that someone, just because someone's famous, or even just because they're an expert in another field, that they automatically have this credibility. To use kind of a silly but obvious example, when famous singers or actors say stuff, they get a lot of attention. But unless they're actually an expert in that field, say like politics or technology or whatever, then their claims are no more credible than anyone else's. Not to say they're wrong. It's just that if someone who's, again, a famous actor, and they start talking about AI, unless they actually have expertise in the field, their claims, even though people will of course listen to them and it will get broadcast, it has no special credibility. Now, a person can be an expert in one field and talk in a field they're not an expert in. So if you have someone, say, who's a physicist, who's talking about ethics or AI or economics, even though they are an expert in physics and could be like really smart, that doesn't automatically translate over to expertise in AI or morality or even other areas of physics, because physics is pretty big. So you want to check to confirm that the person has expertise in that particular subject. Also, of course, going back to like experts quoting other experts, there needs to be an adequate degree of agreement among experts. In terms of like why, here's the answer. If a single expert like makes a claim and there's like lots of experts that disagree and you're not an expert yourself, the question is, which experts do I go with? Now, rationally, the most reasonable thing to do, which could be wrong, this is inductive reasoning, is to go with the majority opinion of the qualified experts. Because if we're arguing based on expertise, it's more likely that many experts would be right than a single expert being right and everyone else being wrong. Could happen, not impossible. Again, this is inductive reasoning. What people often do, however, is they'll tend to believe the expert they like and reject all the experts they dislike. Because you can almost always find someone who's an expert who will say something that goes against the other experts. But a good question is, if I myself have no expertise, why do I happen to pick this one I like over all the other experts when I have no idea what I'm talking about because I'm not an expert? And the answer would typically be because I like that one, as opposed to for good reasons. Now, as I noted, the majority of experts could turn out to be wrong. But as a non-expert, we're not, I would not be, you would not be, if you're not an expert in the field, or I'm not an expert in the field, be in a position to judge like which of them are correct. Now, if we're experts ourselves, then we're in a position to make arguments, with expertise. The expert, of course, needs to be not significantly biased. Now, every person on the planet has got some biases, and otherwise, if we simply rejected everything from everybody who had any biases, you could never believe anything. And so that's why there's a requirement that it not be significantly biased. How much is significant? There's no like exact amount. I mean, you want to look at things like, is there like products they're selling, that they're trying to push on people? Are they pushing like a particular political agenda, etc.? But even if that's the case, even if someone is selling books or products, for example, they could still be right. But you'd want to check for bias. Getting, say, paid for something would be a biasing factor. But again, it doesn't mean that they're wrong. It would just give you grounds for being suspicious. So if a supposed expert is talking about, the importance of some dietary supplement that they're selling on their website, you should definitely be suspicious. They could be right. I mean, they could be completely honest. But a general rule is if someone's trying to sell you something, you should always be suspicious. Last two, their expertise needs to be something that is legitimate, a legitimate area or discipline. And this can be quite contentious because there are people who claim to be experts of various things like crystal healing or other, things. And people might say, well, that's not a legitimate field. And this gets into another whole debate over what is a legitimate field and what is not. And you could usually look at things like, is it well established? Does it have, methodology? Does it have a system for, assessing claims, correcting them? So clearly things like classic science, those would be legitimate fields. Something like crystal healing, less so. Again, but it's not impossible that some new, discipline might have some legitimacy. But always check. Again, especially if someone's trying to sell you stuff, always check. Now, of course, the authority must be properly cited. You've got to identify them, clearly. Because if someone just says, well, experts say, or they say, you don't know, because you're accepting an argument on authority based on the authority of the authority. And so if you can't go and check their authority, how do you know that they're actually good at this? And so it's important to properly cite this. And this leads to, some practical problems outside of philosophy, like in the case of journalism, where they do often cite anonymous sources. For example, they might cite people involved in a criminal investigation who don't want to be identified because they don't want to get, killed, or someone, whistleblower within say the White House, but they don't want to identify themselves because they don't want to get retaliated against and get fired. And so you'd have to judge the credibility of the person making the report, like the journalist, and you're doing that kind of a double argument from authority that, okay, this person, I trust their ability to assess experts, so the expert they're citing is probably correct. So in the case of Socrates' argument, you'd apply these standards. Do the people he talks about, do they have sufficient expertise? Are they talking within their area of expertise? Is there adequate agreement among experts about, in this case, the immortality of the soul? Are priests and poets and stuff, are they biased? Is the study of the soul legitimate discipline? And were the authorities properly cited? And that's how you'd assess. And you could just, go, a way to do this would go through each of the standards, present the standard, apply it, present the next one, apply it. A little bit dull, but very effective. And one effective way to argue is often being, dull, but step by step. Now, once you go through and do the assessment and decide whether it's a strong or weak argument, if it meets the standards effectively, then it would be strong to whatever degree you think it's strong. If it doesn't, it would be weak to whatever degree you think it fails. And so you'd want to explain the consequence of your evaluation. So if you think the argument is, weak, flawed, bad, you might say something like, since Socrates' argument from authority fails, it does not help refute Meno's argument. If you think the argument succeeds, then you have to decide, okay, if the argument from authority works and the soul is immortal, does that help him or does it not? So if you think it succeeds and it helps him, then you might make the case that this makes the doctrine of recollection stronger, helps refute Meno. Or you might say that even though it's a good argument for authority, maybe it doesn't, work in helping him. So you want to be clear about the argument's role. Now, even if this argument fails, it probably is not essential to his case because he doesn't rely just on, okay, the priests and poets and stuff say this, therefore it must be true, therefore my entire case rests on this. He could lose that argument, but there's other arguments, they stand or fall on their own. And if they succeed, they would help support his view. If they fail, of course, they would fail. So one thing that's important to know about argumentation, and it's something that's routinely overlooked in bad faith arguments on the internet, is that a person could have multiple arguments for something, and just because one argument fails doesn't mean that their whole case automatically collapses. Just because there's one argument doesn't succeed in support of the conclusion, if they have other arguments, those arguments could still hold. So that's the first one, the argument from authority. So be sure to assess it. Is it good, strong, or weak? And based on your assessment, how does it impact the overall issue? The next argument is the geometric proof. And two issues here. One is, does the proof show that the servant is engaged in recollection of the sort Socrates claims? Is what happening there what he claims is happening? And then the second thing is the impact. Just like with before, there's the question of does it do what he claims? And then there's a question of, does this help him refute Meno? Does it refute Meno? So how do you tell whether an explanation is good or bad? So what Socrates is saying is basically, look, I talked to this servant, and look, he did this geometry stuff, therefore, he must have an immortal soul, and there must be recollection. So how do you tell whether an explanation is, good or bad or ugly? Well, this is not, of course, an entire critical thinking class, but here are some useful standards for assessing explanations, whether they be about the soul, about vaccines causing autism, about cutting taxes, causing improvement to the economy, whatever you want to talk about, anything from metaphysics to politics, where people are offering explanations to see, does the explanation hold up? First thing is testability. Any claim that's an explanation has got to be testable, because if you can't test it, you have no way of knowing whether it's correct or incorrect. Now, there are things that can be very difficult to test, and there can be things that we may not be able to test like now. So kind of a question is, could this be tested? Does it have testability? If the answer is no, it can't be verified, you should be very suspicious at best, because it doesn't mean it's false, but it means you have no way of confirming it. There's no proof. For example, when people claim that there are other alternative realities, right now it's really, we have no way of, we can probably think of a way to test it. So it's testable in theory if we could build like a machine to go there, or like magic or something. But if someone says like, you can never go there, but trust me, they're real, that would be untestable, because the question would be, how would you even know? Next is simplicity and assumptions. So we'll see more of this in the class when we talk about Occam's razor, because this is Occam's razor, that the fewer assumptions an explanation makes, it's a better explanation. Simpler is better. As Occam, his razor has been kind of presented, we should avoid dubious entities or unlikely events in any explanation, basically keeping it simple. And so the question would be, is this a good explanation in terms of that? Is it the simpler explanation? And there's this notion of philosophical economy. More assumptions means a higher cost. So to use a classic example, kind of ironically with Occam's razor, if you're trying to explain, say, evolution of life, one explanation might involve like God creating life on Earth. In that case, you've got God, you've got life, so you got at least two things going, the universe and God. But if there's an alternative, such as there's just like the Big Bang, no God, and evolution just occurs from physical stuff, you've got a simpler explanation, because you have the world but no God. Then the question would be, it's simpler, but does it still work? So testability important. Is Socrates' explanation testable, and is it appropriately simple? Other standards include consistency. This is like a generic assessment of explanations. So good explanations will tend to align with well-established theories. It'll fit in with existing science, economics, chemistry, whatever you're talking about. Now, of course, you can have explanations that are inconsistent with the science of the day, or whatever you're talking about, and that's in a way how we make scientific improvement. You come up with something like, wow, this explains it, doesn't match this. Now, in most cases, things that are inconsistent with the well-established theories, they're usually wrong, but not always, which is so why you need to consider, is this explanation, so good and so established that it can overturn existing theories? And sometimes that happens. You get a revolution or evolution in science. There's also the standard of explanatory power. If a theory, explanation explains more stuff, then that's good, because their goal is explanation. So essentially, the greater output with fewer assumptions is ideal. It's very much an economic style standard. You're essentially, explanatory power is like getting features on a smartphone for less money. And same idea. You want to get as much, say, phone for as little money as possible. You want to get as much explanation for little cost as possible. Now, some requirements are also, kind of like logical, like it needs to be clear and precise, avoiding circular reasoning, which is assuming what needs to be proven. For example, if someone says, why can't that person, finish their book? And someone says, well, if they have writer's block, they're just saying the same thing twice. They can't write because they can't write. And of course, it shouldn't be, excessively vague, shouldn't be ambiguous, etc. Lastly, should be an intuitive fit that should match our intuitions, but of course, intuitions can be wrong. So if it doesn't match our intuitions, it should explain why we should accept the explanation in place of our intuitions. And sometimes things are counterintuitive. It's like that shouldn't work, but yet it does. Or it should work and yet it doesn't. Now, if you're doing a comparison type of explanation, and typically explanations do work in a competitive way, an explanation, of course, is stronger, relatively speaking, if its rivals are weaker, just like in a competition, like on the track. If you're running against people who are slower, you're going to perform better. Of course, if they're faster, you'll perform worse. And of course, you can argue by challenging alternatives or defending your own. So you'd want to go through and assess it based on those standards. And again, you could just kind of go through the ones that are most relevant and say, by the standard, the explanation is good or bad. And it's kind of by like the weight. If it's like, meets the standards effectively, good. If it doesn't, then bad. So in terms of assessing the explanation some more, there's also the method of best explanation. So kind of the first thing would be to assess it in terms of, is it a good explanation sort of overall? Now you can also add in here the best explanation approach. So the central question here is this: what best explains the servant's ability to complete the geometric proof? So if you agree with Socrates, you would want to argue for these things, that the servant has this latent or innate knowledge. You'd want to support the idea that Socrates is generally eliciting this knowledge, and then address the obvious concerns about leading questions, influencing the responses. Because kind of the stock, criticism of the Meno is Socrates just, fed the person the answers and wasn't recollecting them. Now, if you disagree with Socrates, again, the same central question is there. You would want to either propose a more plausible alternative, which is typically, this is the alternative that Socrates is providing these leading questions, that the answer is in the question, so it's not being recollected, it's being given to them. And the way to do this would be to use, direct quotes, not like quoting like endlessly and just, irrelevantly, but finding, quotes that would illustrate best that he, take like a key thing and show how that quote actually contains, Socrates, what he claims he's getting the servant to recollect, it's actually in the quote. When he asks the question, showing that it's in there. Again, if you disagree with Socrates. Then the last thing to do in this part is, for the second argument, the explanation argument, is the impact. So you'll need to state the impact of your assessment on his overall case. So that would be essentially, you think it either doesn't work or works. If you think that the walkthrough that he does is flawed, then you'd say it. You'd say something like, Socrates gave the servant the answers, so the walkthrough does not help refute Meno's argument, as an example. And you're making it clear, to use the obvious analogy, it's like in a courtroom. A good lawyer will make their case, but they'll always be clear. They just won't leave it and just go blah, 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 evidence, blah, 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 legal stuff, and then just sit down. A good lawyer will say, make it explicitly clear what you, as a jury member or judge, are supposed to take away from their case, giving that impact. And similar thing here, basically saying this is what impact it has on his case. Now, if you think that the walkthrough succeeds, you'd want to be clear about its relevance. And you could take the view that it does, have a positive impact. Namely, you'd say, yes, the walkthrough makes sense, and you'd want to say why it proves a doctrine of recollection. If no, for some reason, which is an option, you would say that, yes, recollection occurs, but doesn't actually solve the challenge. So now again, if you think the argument is flawed, it's automatic, it doesn't help because, flawed argument can't support the case. If you think it succeeds, you could still hold the view that even though the walkthrough makes sense, that somehow it doesn't support his case. So that's the second argument. And next we'll head to the third and final argument, the dilemma. So in terms of assessing the dilemma, there are two sub-issues here, not surprisingly. So the first one is about the quality of the dilemma itself. Is the dilemma that he gives a strong argument? And then, as always, the second thing is, does it successfully, refute or help refute Meno's argument? Does it succeed as an argument? So one way to do this is by connecting the second argument to the third argument, the walkthrough argument to the dilemma argument. So you could argue that if argument 2 fails, then argument 3 also likely fails, because argument 3 depends on the success of recollection and argument number 2. And so what you do, of course, also is show how the failure of one undermines the other. Now, it's also possible to argue that if argument 2 succeeds, that argument 3 still fails, which would be explaining why recollection might work, yet not support the broader case that he makes in argument 3. So the core question here in addressing the dilemma, the third argument, is this. What best explains the servant's ability to reason through the geometry problem? Now, if you agree with Socrates, this may seem kind of like a repeat of the previous one because it's similar. If you agree with Socrates, you would argue that the servant does in fact possess this pre-birth knowledge, that they knew things, when they were dead. And you'd want to support the idea that the soul acquired this knowledge before birth and evaluate Socrates' explanation using those standards, testability, simplicity, explanatory power, which would be pretty much a recap of what was done for the second argument. And you could refer back to that. If you disagree with Socrates, you'd want to argue that his explanation is flawed and perhaps propose a more plausible alternative. Again, we've seen this before, that leading questions guide the servant's responses, and then be sure to assess, of course, both explanations by those same standards. And then you'd want to go to the impact, which would be to state the impact of your assessment on Socrates' overall case. So if the explanation is flawed, you may say something like, Socrates' explanation is inferior to a rival, so does not help refute Meno's argument. If the explanation succeeds, then you want to clarify its relevance. So if you think that the explanation is successful, you'd want to say, okay, does it help refute Meno's argument? If yes, you'd support this with reasoning, that recollection supports innate knowledge. If no, you'd want to show why recollection doesn't address this challenge. Then once you've addressed the third argument, the dilemma argument, and one way to speed this up is not to just repeat everything you said for the second argument, but show how what you said about the second argument, the explanation, applies to the dilemma. How because the dilemma depends pretty heavily obviously on the recollection argument. And so you don't have to redo everything. You can kind of show how the second argument, again, is noted, how that its credibility or success impacts the third. The final thing to do for the argument section is tying it all together. And again, going back to the courtroom analogy, when someone's arguing in court, if they're good at lawyering, and they don't just go evidence, blah, blah, legal stuff, blah, 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 and then just sit down and have you just as a jury or the judge just looking at them like, what's their point? You'd want to make sure that each of the arguments you give, you're always clear about the impact. And this may seem kind of tedious and repetitive, but you want people to know what it is you've shown. Again, just like in a court of law, you wouldn't want to overdo it to the point where the jury and judge is oh God, what's wrong with this person? But you want to make it clear what they should conclude. And so the final part of the argument section should be tying it all together. To very briefly summarize the impact of your evaluation on all three arguments. For example, if you think all three arguments fail, it'd be a quick tying it all together, which would be, given that all three of Socrates' arguments failed, it follows that he did not refute Meno's argument. Super easy. Again, the tying it all together doesn't have to be, lengthy. It can be very, very concise. If you think that two or more arguments succeeded, especially if argument 3 succeeded because it directly addresses Meno's challenge, you would say something like, given that Socrates' critical argument succeeded, it follows that it refutes Meno's argument. And be sure to sort of concisely but explicitly connect your evaluation to that challenge. And again, just imagine yourself like a lawyer in court, doing your wrapping it up. If argument 3 fails somehow, the likely conclusion is that Socrates does fail to refute Meno, because the third argument is rather central to addressing Meno's dilemma. But again, if you think all three arguments fail, then obviously it's auto-fail. If less than 3 fail, then it could be his case might fail, but it might not. It gets more, as I say, more complicated. So how do you tell when you get a good argument, or what are you aiming to do? Well, the cards of assessment are these. Needs to have completeness, state your positions, address all the key issues. The points are broken up among, there's 3 arguments to assess and the impact. So the points are broken up among those. So if parts are just missing, that would, even if the rest is good, that leaves like some important stuff out. Just like if you buy a car and say everything's great except it doesn't have an engine, that's pretty bad. The writing should be, clear. Presentation should be well done. Paragraphs are very good. Should have good organization. If there are any citations, used properly. Ideally should be original, should be relevant, and quality arguments. Also have, of course, the rubrics breaking down point by point, how the points break down point by point, ranging from the excellent all the way down to failing. The final part is the conclusion. And this is super easy, barely an inconvenience. So pro tip for this is to do your conclusion, just copy paste your introduction, paste it into the conclusion, and make 2 changes. Change 1 is you go from the future tense, like I will argue, to the past tense. I argue that. With the position, you could say like your position remains the same. You don't have to say like my position was, but you can if you want to. And you would say, instead of I will argue, you'd say I argued. And you'll replace the minimal background, because you've already given it, with some final remark. That's just in there for the 5th point. It could be something like, although Socrates, brought up the idea of the soul is immortal, now he either knows or doesn't know because he's super dead. Or maybe he's back. Maybe one of us is Socrates, or whatever. And that's worth 5 points, 125 words or less. And again, it's only worth 5 points, so you don't want to go on and on and on with a conclusion. And speaking of conclusions, that concludes the in-depth look at the Meno paper, and stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.